Good morning. Good morning. How are we doing this morning? Good. Everybody good? Glad you're here this morning. Glad you made it. And real quick, what I want to do before we get going, does anybody have those people in your family, like it's Thanksgiving week, and when you sit down with your family, you sit down around a table, and you have that one person, you know the one I'm talking about, in your family who, like, when you sit down for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, they're the one who's like, let's go around the table and everybody say what they're thankful for. Anybody have you know who you are if you're, okay, you know who you are. Okay, yeah. Everybody has one in their family. My family, I grew up with a family who was less of the emotional type. If I don't know how to say that nicely, like we were not emotional people, and so we didn't do this a whole lot because that was like expressing your feelings, and we weren't taught to express our feelings. Meanwhile, my wife's family is the opposite, and they only have feelings, and just they live on feelings. Just so many feelings in a room all the time, just all the feelings all the time, and it took me a while to get used to that. And so my wife is the one at my family's table who, I remember the first time we sat together for a meal with my family, it was Christmas, and she was like, let's go around the table and say what everybody's favorite part of this year was. And my family literally, verbally, out loud groaned. Like, you could hear, oh. And then then we had talks about, are you sure you want to marry her? There was a lot of things after that followed that. But real quick, I want to be that person because it's that week and that's what's going on. Look at the person next to you, just talk to them for just a second and tell them something that today you could say, I am grateful for this one thing. Just tell them something that you are grateful for. Look at them. You can get more than one if you have more than one, but something you're grateful for today, something you've got, something that's happened, something in your life, someone, etc. Maybe you're grateful for people that make you feel things, who melt your icy heart. Yeah, Marie is convinced, like, I don't cry, I don't have a lot of emotions to me, and she's convinced that someday those floodgates are going to open, and when they open, they won't close. She's convinced that I'm going to start like crying one day, and I am just going to not stop for days. Everything's going to come out that's been bottled up inside of me for a long time. I don't think that's going to happen. I think I just am not a human, and I lack that part of me. Yeah, I lack that part of me. And so I apologize for that. So today we're going to look at being grateful. Now, here's the thing. If you're a person in this room who's a follower of Jesus, if you're a person who says, no, I practice and I follow the way of Jesus, when it comes to gratitude, you cannot separate your gratefulness, your gratitude. Your gratefulness is directly correlated to God's faithfulness, right? There's nothing that we can be grateful for that does not happen because we believe that our God was faithful to us. There's nothing to be grateful for if he's not faithful, right? Does that make sense? These two things are so interlinked. If you believe that God has been faithful to you, then you are grateful for that. If you believe you're grateful for something, it's because God's been faithful to you. The correlation works both ways. It's almost impossible to separate one from the other, right? And so today, I want to talk a little bit about gratefulness. I want to talk about faithfulness of God specifically. And I want to look at that through the lens of the apostles. So we've been in this series called Tribe, and we're looking at Jesus and his teachings, specifically in the moments that he's just with his people, his tribe, his disciples. Jesus, again, he teaches on multiple levels. There's moments where he's teaching thousands of people. There's moments where he's teaching hundreds of people. There's moments where he's teaching tens of people. Then there's the moments he's teaching just the disciples. There's even moments where he's teaching just the 3 disciples he was closest with within those 12. And today we're going to kind of look at those concentric circles happen, but we're really in this series just trying to look at the moments where he just spends time just with those disciples, those people closest to him. What does he teach them? And how can we learn from them? How can we learn from where they sit? How can we put ourselves in their sandals? How can we understand how this all works from their point of view? Because there's got to be a reason that Jesus calls 12 guys together. There's got to be a reason he has followers here on this earth. Remember, Jesus doesn't come to earth and then suddenly say, as he gets to earth, oh, you know what? I need people to fill in my weaknesses. Maybe you at work, when you put people around you at work and you hire a staff or a team, it's because you're well, I'm not very good at bookkeeping, or I'm not very good at speaking or whatever the things are. You say, I need somebody around these things. And maybe those are the things that you start to fill in the gaps on. When Jesus came to earth, we don't think of Jesus having weaknesses. He is God incarnate. So why does he put a team around him? Why does he put people around him? And there must be a reason that he calls these guys together, because they and what they learn and what they experience during this time is going to infiltrate the rest of the world until today. What those men did after Jesus left, what they had seen and what they took with them, that grew and grew and grew and grew until what we see today. This was all on the backs of 12 pretty messed up fellas. And so there must be some reason that Jesus called them, and there must be something he's teaching them in these moments. Now, in the Bible, we don't get a lot of moments where Jesus pulls away with just the 12. We really don't get that many. And so this series, we've looked at those specifically, and today we're going to look at probably the most famous moment that we're probably all familiar with. In fact, if you were to think of a picture of Jesus and his disciples, you'd probably think of one picture. There's probably one that comes to mind, and it's called the Last Supper. And you've probably seen this picture before. This isn't your first time. This is, of course, when Jesus said, everybody get on this side of the table. We're going to take a picture, right? That's what this whole thing was about. And I think we have some misnomers about this whole thing, because it's not actually the way we see it and the way we visualize this Last Supper painting. What Da Vinci did in this is fascinating. And he really does some stuff that's really brilliant inside of this painting, where he depicts and portrays what Jesus is doing with his disciples in this moment. And so what we have, if you pay attention to this picture here, now, first of all, we usually see this as a picture that's on canvas, that like is framed somewhere. If you're familiar with this painting, it's not framed, it's not on canvas. This painting is on a wall in a convent in Milan, Italy. Like it's on a wall. It's not something you could take down or something you could just carry with you. This painting was designed to be on a wall in a dining room in Milan, Italy. It is 29 feet wide and 15 feet high. It's massive. And while you would imagine it's a fresco because it's on this plaster, Da Vinci did not want to do frescoes, so he made it a whole different type of thing. He made it his own little work of art. He didn't want to be quantified as a fresco, so he made his own thing. So going across this, as you can see, Jesus is in the middle. And actually, as Da Vinci painted this, it was interesting because it took him about 3 years to paint this, because Da Vinci was never in a hurry, and he was a well-known procrastinator. I don't know if you know any artists like this. Maybe a couple, but he was a well-known procrastinator. And it took him 3 years to get this thing done. And he would just come and go and would just leave the painting for months at a time and then show up again and paint a little bit more and then leave. Such an artiste, right? And so Jesus in the middle, and this spot right here where Jesus is, actually Jesus' right eye right here, this eye was a focal point of the entire thing. Da Vinci put a nail there, and then he would take strings out through the rest of the painting so that he would have one focal point. And if you pay attention to all the walls, the ceiling, everything is moving into that one focal point. He wanted Jesus to be right at the center, that you couldn't miss Jesus in this painting. He didn't get lost in the painting. Jesus was the center of the painting. And so he put a nail right there, and he would then take these strings to see the rest of it so that the perspective would all be focused right around Jesus, right? Then over here, we've got over across here, we've got some of the disciples, right? So this is Bartholomew. We've talked about some of the disciples. Again, it's fascinating how few of us even know the disciples' names, which is interesting, even though they're kind of important guys. Bartholomew's all the way on the left. Bartholomew is also known as Nathaniel through some of the books of the Bible. He's called Nathaniel. He has a Greek name and a Jewish name. And he was a guy who actually probably went into other parts of the world and did some amazing things. If you're familiar with the Armenian history, actually Bartholomew converted the king of Armenia to following Jesus, which changed the entire landscape. Later, he was then pulled apart, literally, by the Armenians. They tied him up and they pulled him apart. So that's the thanks he got for that. Being a follower of Jesus is always fun. It's always easy. This is right here is James the Lesser. Remember, there's James the Greater, James the Lesser. James the Lesser was the younger of the two. He was the younger, not the greater in this sense meant older, which again, as you get older, just call yourself greater. It sounds better. This year I'm 50 years, great. I'm 50, great. You're just leveling up every time. Do that. And so he's James the Lesser. We only see about 4 verses of James the Lesser in the entire New Testament. We don't know a lot about him. But then we go to this guy's Andrew. He's got his hands up like this. He's doing in this. Andrew is the bringer of the bunch. What we see with Andrew is he brings other disciples to Jesus. He brings other people to Jesus. We'll do a series someday on him because he's fascinating. But like in the feeding of 5,000, Andrew's the one that goes out and finds the little boy that has the food. Andrew is the one that brings Philip and Peter to Jesus. It's likely they were followers of John the Baptist before this, and that Andrew brought them to Jesus. He's kind of this bringer, so that's what he's known for. Then right in this like cluster here, you have Simon Peter right here. He's kind of behind, and he's having this conversation on the side with John. John is probably Jesus' youngest disciple, this one right here. Of course, if you, and then the guy in front of them is Judas. Of course, if you're familiar with this, so Simon Peter, one of Jesus' closest guys, he's talking to John. If you're familiar with the Da Vinci Code, anybody read that or seen that movie? This is where this comes in. If you read the Da Vinci Code, I've read it. Just remember, it's a great novel. It is not real, but there's a big part in there about John being a woman. This is Mary Magdalene. Now, it is possible, just so you know, it is possible that Da Vinci did paint a woman in that spot. He may have used different models from around the town. In fact, when he painted Judas, it's believed that he found a criminal from their prison system and used him as their Judas in this painting. So it is possible, but this is definitely John. John is the youngest of the bunch. That's why he painted him being a little bit less like manly, basically. It's because John, when he started following Jesus, was probably 13 or 14 years old. He was the youngest of the bunch. This is John who writes the book of John. He writes the Gospel of John. He also writes the book of Revelation. This is John here. So Judas right here, if you notice, there's a bag of money in his hand. We can figure out what that probably is. Judas betrays Jesus for silver. He gets pieces of silver. He gets these silver coins. A fun fact in that bag, if this is what this is, it could be just, there's two reasons he could have a bag. One is that he could have been saying this is the silver coins that he took. The other is that Judas was the treasurer of this group. He actually handled the money for the whole group. So we don't know which one it is, but it is interesting if you ever see the coins that were in this day, the silver coins. They were the ones that Caesar Tiberius had made, and on the back of them they had a picture of Caesar Tiberius, who was the emperor, and it says on it that he is the Prince of Peace. That's on the coin. Caesar Tiberius is saying he is the Prince of Peace. And every coin had his face with that title on it. Just think about that when you think about how Jesus ended up getting killed not long after this. It's because he comes along and says, no, I'm the Prince of Peace. There's already a person who thinks he's that. It's very interesting politically what's going on. So he shows up. So this bag right here is Judas. He shows up here. There's another reason this is happening here. We'll get to that in a second. So John's having this conversation. Then over here we have Jesus, of course, in the middle. He's got both hands on the table, one up, one down. And then over in this group, we've got, so this is James the Greater. The reason that James is here and John is here is because there's a moment in the New Testament that John and James's mother asks, can my son sit on your right and your left in your kingdom? That's something that's asked of Jesus by their mother. And so this painting has them on his right and on his left, sitting right on the sides of him. So we have John, this is back here, this guy is Thomas. Thomas is standing there with his finger up like this. We don't know why that is necessarily, but he's very serious about having his finger in the air, and he's got things to say. So Thomas is back here. It's believed that possibly it's because Thomas, if you remember, Thomas is the one that doubts that Jesus came back from the dead. And he doubts it, and so Jesus appears to him. He gets called Doubting Thomas. He appears to him, and then Thomas touches that spot in Jesus' hands, the nail holes. He feels that. It's possible that's why he has his finger up, because this is the finger that would have touched that. But he's known as Doubting Thomas. He's also called Didymus, which means that he's a twin. He's a twin. So if you ask Thomas, hey, Thomas, are you a twin? He'd probably say, I doubt it. That's a pastor joke. It's not a good joke. It's a pastor joke. There's two different kinds of jokes. This is a pastor joke, but he would say, but he is a twin, probably. That's what we know. This is Philip. Philip is brothers with Peter and Andrew, and Philip is over here on this side. Then we've got in this last trio, he kind of does this in threes if you pay attention. There's threes that are happening. Right here we've got Matthew. Remember, Matthew was a tax collector. He was a rebel of this group because at one point he walked completely away from the Jewish faith, completely away from all of religion, and was a tax collector for Rome. He worked for the man. And so we have him. Then we have Jude right here, or Thaddeus. Jude would have been his other name. He is possibly the guy who wrote the book of Jude in the New Testament. We're not sure. There was also a Jude named, or another guy named Jude, who was Jesus' brother. That could be him there. And this last guy here is Simon the Zealot. Simon is a politician. He was a guy who would have been a very conservative man. He would have been very involved in conservative politics. And just like everybody, when you're in politics, these guys are asking the questions, and he's like, well, I don't know. That's every politician, I think. So this works, holds up. And so if you notice, there's all these little intricacies. There's groups of three. He's talking about the Trinity. Then there's all these little things happening. One of the things is people believe, because he was a musician as well, Da Vinci, that if you took the bread that's across the table and the hands, that there was actually a musical score being written. So if you took the bread, it would be a bass line happening. So it'd be like dum 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 da da dum dum. Dum, 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 da, da, dum, dum. That's what some people believe. So, half of you heard Another One Bites the Dust. Half of you heard Ice Ice Baby. Depends on which generation you are. And neither one's wrong. It's a win-win. But that's what some people believe, is there's a bass line happening there. Yeah, and then there's this moment right here where you see Judas's hand is outstretched and Jesus' hand is outstretched towards the same piece of bread. Do you see that? That is because in Luke 22, what we're going to see is there's just one quick moment where Jesus says, the hand of my betrayer is on the table with mine, is also on this table with mine. The hand of my betrayer is on the table. And so notice how Jesus' hand is on the table, and so is Judas's. Just a fun fact. So today we're going to look at this picture, and we're going to go into the moment that this happens. We're going to spend a little bit of time just on the Last Supper. If you're not familiar with it, there's a lot of terms for it. Communion or the Eucharist, or in Jude it's called the Love Feast, which I like that one the most because it sounds like a good 70s band. There's a lot of terms, a lot of names, breaking of bread for this practice of communion or of the Eucharist or of this Last Supper, the Lord's Supper. And we're going to just look at this real quick because I think there's some things about gratitude, about faithfulness that we can learn from what's happening in this moment that maybe we need to take into our own weeks this week. Maybe there's things we need to take to our tables this week as we celebrate what we call Thanksgiving. Maybe we need to have some of those moments in our rooms and in our tables. Maybe we need to let people actually be grateful and share gratitude around the table. So if you have a Bible or a phone or a tablet, whatever you use, we're going to go to Luke chapter 22. And there are accounts of this in all four Gospels. We're going to look at Luke specifically for just a couple reasons we'll get to in a second. But it starts off in Luke chapter 22 with this. It says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John," notice two of his favorite guys, he takes two of his favorites here. He sends Peter and John saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat Passover." So Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are happening. These are both Jewish festivals that they would have celebrated. It would have been like if you took the 4th of July and Thanksgiving and kind of made it one big holiday. That's what was happening. They were almost interchangeable celebrations. They both happened almost simultaneously, and they could both happen almost at the same time because they were so close to one another. So that you would have Passover, and then you would have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They were one thing. And it says that they were supposed to kill this Passover lamb. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, this is a story that goes about 1,500 years, so just buckle in because for the next 3.5 hours, I'm going to walk through all of it. But 1,500 years of history has happened. And really what's happened, if you go to Exodus chapter 12, there's a passage that I want to kind of just look at real quick because this is where God instructs his people on how to have this celebration. It's in Exodus chapter 12. It begins in verse 24. It says this, "Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, observe this ceremony. The ceremony they're talking about is this ceremony, Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the same ceremony that God's talking about. And he says, and when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed and worshiped. So what happened? What happened when God did this original ceremony, this original moment, is if you remember, all of the Israelites, God's chosen people, are in oppression. They've been slaves for 400 years. Generation upon generation upon generation has lived in slavery. They've lived under oppression. They've lived without their own rule or reign. They only exist to build or to serve the Egyptians, who are overlords and masters of theirs. And God comes along and says, this isn't right. Now, we believe this to be true of any oppression. We believe this to be true of anything in our day and age. This is why our church is so heavily involved with human trafficking. It's because we believe this is not the way that people should be living. That there's a God in heaven who says, no, oppression should not be happening. And so he goes to rescue these oppressed people. And he pulls them out of Egypt. And he gets to rescue them, and they cross the Red Sea. There's all kinds of amazing things happen. But he says to them at the end of the ceremony, he says, I want you to find a lamb, and this lamb is going to cover all of your sin, all of your shame, all of the terrible things, and we're going to kill that lamb. You're going to take all the sins of your community, all the sins, all the shame that you've carried, we're going to put it on this lamb, and that lamb will be killed. And with that lamb being killed, you are now forgiven. You now have a new start. You now have a new life because this lamb has been killed. This is a powerful ceremony. Every year then, what he tells them is, it says that what are we supposed to do with this though? What's the point of this ceremony? Part of it's to release this sin and this shame, but part of this ceremony, he says, is that when your children ask you about it, you're to tell them, this is a Passover to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. He wants you to tell the story. I wonder how much we've missed the boat on this, just being completely honest with you. This a couple weeks ago, I had some time, and my daughter and I were had a little bit of time together, just the two of us, and we were sitting in the house. She was very sick, and she was not feeling well. It was just the two of us in the house, and we were sitting there, and we started talking. And most of what Jane talks about is things I do not understand. It's a lot of other languages or things she's made up. She talks about our dog a lot, more than me or any other human I know. And so she just talks about other things. And we were sitting there, though, we were having this conversation, and she was talking about things that were other than this. And then as we got to talking, we started talking about how she was sick, and I told her I remember when she was a baby and she was sick. And I remember how much it hurt me that she was sick and how hard it was for us to watch her as a young girl as she was sick, and how it is hard now to watch her. Parents, you know what I'm talking about. And like how difficult that was. And then we went back even further, and we started talking about her being born and her coming into this earth. And I remember we were sitting there talking about it, and I started telling her, like, Jane, we didn't know if we'd ever have you. Like, we spent years hoping and praying for a child, and God wasn't giving us a child. And I told her, I said, Jane, do you know what your name means? And she said, no. I said, your name means God's gracious gift. Do you know why we named you that? No, why? Because we believed that we were praying and waiting for God to give us a child. We were doing all the earthly actions it takes. There was something that wasn't happening. And we believe that children only come from God. There's no accident about that. And that there has to be a maker who's not us, who's creating this child, who knits them together in their mother's womb. And we were praying and waiting for her. And when she finally came about, I'll never forget the day after years of coming home every single month and seeing my wife just as a puddle on the floor, just laying there and being so sad and in tears every single month. After years of that, I'll never forget the day I came home and there was a positive pregnancy test and it was the best day of her life. And she starts writing down this day on every calendar she has. She starts writing it down, marking it, saying, I'll never forget this day. This day, the Lord came through. She starts marking down. We still, in our house, if you ever walk into our house, there's a little spot over by the garage door where we hang our keys, and on the top of it, there's a whiteboard. And on that whiteboard, it still says April 29th, and it says a very good day with a smiley face. We've never erased that. It is permanently stuck on there because we've never felt the need to, because that was a really good day. And so we named her Jane because she was God's gracious gift. And you know what? I hadn't told her the story. I just wonder how many times are we missing this opportunity around our tables? How many times as a family or as people who even just follow Jesus, are we sitting there and we know that there's been a moment that God has been faithful to us and we just forget or miss the opportunity or whatever it is, or we get fearful and we don't tell the story? How many times have we done that? I seriously, I'm not just saying this, I seriously wonder if it's why faith is not being passed down from generation to generation. We know that we live in a world right now where 3/4 of people who turn 18 years old when they graduate high school, 3/4 of 18-year-olds will walk away from the church. 75%. Well, that's a lot. Why is that? And I think it's because they think we keep coming back to church and it's this ritual we have to do, this thing that we're made to do because that's what we're supposed to do. But at the end of the day, it's not doing anything for us because we don't understand that there are people in this room, I guarantee you every person in this room has a moment where they believe that God has come through for them. The problem is we haven't told anybody. We're not passing it down. Right now, we know that the table is being taken away from us, sitting around tables like Jesus did. Jesus, there are 15 times in the book of Luke alone that he sits around tables. We know that the being around tables is important. Again, the Atlantic did a study at one point. The Atlantic magazine did a study. If you want your kids to have good grades, if you want your kids to not have eating disorders, if you want your kids to be able to have more vocabulary than other kids, if you want your kids to have high self-esteem, the number one thing you can do to have all of those things is have consistent family dinners around a table. That's not even by Jesus. That's like by a magazine that did studies on this for years. We're losing the art of being around tables and having these conversations. For 1,500 years, from the time this happens in the book of Exodus, the time this happens in the book of Exodus to the time that Jesus is sitting around a table with his disciples, that's 1,500 years. And how did the gospel keep being spread? How did this message keep being passed down? It wasn't by everybody having a Bible in their hands because everybody didn't. It wasn't by having more devotional books because people weren't writing books. It wasn't by having powerful preachers. It was by having families that sat around tables and passed their faith down from generation to generation to generation. Today, just so you know, one out of every 5 meals you eat will just be in your car anyways. That's just the world we live in. There's an art of the table that we're missing. And Jesus understood it. And for all these centuries, we see this art of this table, this story just being passed down. And I just wonder, why are we missing this around our tables? What are the things you're grateful for, the things that you have seen God's faithfulness in over and over and over again that right now you have not passed down? I guarantee you have a moment somewhere in your life where you believe God has intervened. I really believe that. Who else knows that? Who else have you told about it? Have you passed that down? Or have we gotten a little bit scared? And what we started to rely on is people like me, or pastors, or books. And we started to say, it's not unlike what we see in other things. Like, so if I want my kid to go learn the piano, what do? I hire a piano instructor, somebody who's a professional. And we think sometimes if I want my kids to learn about Jesus, what I need to do is hire a professional. And I'll bring them to that person, and they'll take care of it. We get your family an hour a week. You get your family the rest of that time. God did not start, and when he began his entire lineage and plan of how he was going to redeem the world, he did not start his whole plan with a church. He did not start his whole plan with a government. He did not start his whole plan with a school system. He started with a family. He gave Abraham a family. That was his entire redemptive plan. And it started with him passing his faith down to his kids, and them to their kids, and them to their kids. So what he's saying here is, tell them this story. And for 1,500 years, this story gets told over and over and over again, until Jesus is now sitting with his disciples and he's celebrating this same meal. He's celebrating this moment of God's faithfulness. He's celebrating this with his disciples around a table, and he's having the same story being told. So if you go back to Luke chapter 22, it says in verse 9, they asked Jesus, where do you want us to prepare for it? Where should we have this meal, they asked. And Jesus replies, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, where is the guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples? Okay, guys, just so you know, this is a bad idea. If you're reading this, just real quick, all Jesus tells them is, go to a city. Like he says, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. That is real vague. I don't know, just a jar of water, just that's all it says. And then it just says, follow him to a house that he enters. Like basically like when he enters the house, you just walk in behind him. Like, I'll go with you. My wife did this one time. It was not advisable. She was going to a party at some friend's house, and they were having a movie night with a bunch of girls, and they were all getting together at this real big house out in the woods. And so she didn't have the address quite right, but she got near it, and she parked at the house next door to that house. And it was also a big house out in the woods and in the middle of nothing. And so she just parked there, and she saw a girl walking up to the door of that house that she was parked at. And she was like, well, she's going in. And she thought, I don't know every girl who's going to be at this movie night, so I'll just follow her in. And so she just followed her in, and the girl walked in front of her and opened the door, and Marie just walked in with her. And then the lady looked at her and was like, can I help you? And Marie was like, I'm here for the movie night. Lady was like, are we having a movie night now? And she was like, and Marie was like, I think I'm at the wrong house. And the girl was like, I think you are too. And Marie left, and the charges were dropped later. All Jesus is saying is follow the guy, just follow him into a house, and that's all you need to know. This is where the disciples show that they start to trust Jesus. I mean, there are so many moments that if they hadn't been following Jesus for the last 3 years, if they hadn't given everything up to follow him and hadn't seen miracle after miracle and all these things that Jesus is doing, do you think they would have done this? Probably not, but they're at this place where they're starting to see his faithfulness, and they're starting to understand it, and so they do what he says. They go for it. They just follow along, and they do what he says. And he replies, and so after that, it says, he will show you a large upper room, all furnished. Make preparations there. So they left and found the things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared for the Passover. And when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. So this would have been part of the ceremony of the Passover dinner. The Passover dinner was a long thing. It wasn't like a quick meal. It was a long process of different things, different courses, different things that meant different things along the way. And so it says that he says to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. In fact, the phrase he says here in Greek is, I have desired that I have desired. Like, it's almost like this just over the top. I'm so excited about this moment, which is weird because he also finishes the last sentences as before I suffer, which is a real downer on the dinner, you would think. He says he's trying to give them hints as to what's to come, because in the next few hours, he's going to be arrested. He's going to be taken to a cross. And this is going to be kind of the end of these disciples at this moment being together. They're going to scatter for a while until he comes back. And so it says that he speaks to them and says this. And then it says, after taking, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. This isn't just saying that I won't eat it again until I have gone to heaven or will have it again in heaven. He's saying this whole story, this whole understanding of this lamb that must be killed to cover your sin and your shame, that completion is what's about to happen. That fulfillment is what's about to happen. So it says after that, taking the cup, verse 17, he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then in verse 19, he took the bread and he gave thanks and broke it. Now, in our understanding of this is a very short sentence. It's kind of truncated. And so it says a couple things that happen here. First of all, it says, he took the bread and he gave thanks. And if you've ever taken part of the Eucharist, if you understand the communion, if you've ever heard it called the Eucharist, that's where we get the word from. The word give thanks is Eucharisto, which is Eucharist essentially, right? And it's saying we're giving thanks, that we're giving thanks because of God's great, or his great faithfulness to us. We're showing our gratitude to him. His faithfulness to us reciprocates our gratefulness to him. So he's been faithful to us. And so Jesus begins by taking the bread and giving thanks, this Eucharist moment. Now, in our minds, the giving thanks could be something really short, right? Like what we usually think of, and this is actually where, just so you know, the idea of praying before every meal came from. If you're a family who prays before your meals, or if you do that on your own, that's great. It's a great practice. That's where this came from. This wasn't like a normal human practice until then. Before this, Jews would have prayed 3 times a day on their own. They didn't pray in front of meals. But this would have been a time where that started to happen. Because we see Jesus give thanks for this meal, we started to give thanks for every meal. But one of the problems is, I think we give thanks at a really short, giving thanks before our meals, I don't know about you, is really something that sometimes feels so just inauthentic. Anybody? You ever pray for your meal and sit down and you say grace, if you will, and it turns into a meet the parents moment or something? You're just trying to get through it and just trying to say it, and you have these recited words that you say every time. Everybody has their phrases they like to use during this time. And the problem is, when Jesus is doing that, what he's giving thanks for is not just this one little meal. Jesus is giving thanks for this entire story of redemption. What he would have been praying for is so much bigger. One of the problems is, I think we all learned our rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub type of prayers. We all learned those, right, Jesus eat, what was it, Jesus eat, let's eat, I think was one that I learned when I was growing up. You have these little things that were quick little recited prayers. The problem is some of us have never gotten past that. And I think that we've missed the point. I mean, sometimes doesn't it feel like such a terrible one-way phone call, like a prank call on God, where you pray this quick prayer before your meal, and nothing in it is authentic, nothing in it really matters. You don't listen for him to say anything back. You just speak as quick as you can, get it over with, and then you hang up. I mean, it feels that way to me sometimes, that I feel like God would be like, that was it? That's all we got? I have so much more to say, and you have so much more to say, and we have so much more that we could talk about here. And Jesus is giving thanks for a much bigger picture than just that. And then he breaks the bread. Now, when he breaks the bread, this is Luke's favorite term for communion, is the breaking of bread, or they would break bread in their homes, that kind of thing. That's what that means. Every time you see that, it actually means communion. Breaking of bread. The breaking of bread reminds us that we are, first of all, it's kind of a Mediterranean term, but what it really means is that we understand that we're not independent of others. We are grateful for the other people. We were teaching our kids this week we were at a farm, and we were teaching our kids about how all these things come together to make one thing. So we were at a farm, we were looking at how they grew wheat and they were growing barley and they had animals that were giving eggs or giving meat. And as we were learning all these things, we're learning there's farmers that have to do each one of these things and they have to bring all these pieces together. So when we go to the Walmart and we buy the bread, that's not all it took. Right? There were a bunch of people that it took to make that one thing happen. When we break bread, it was a reminder that we are not independent of other people. And so first he gives thanks to God, saying this isn't just me, but I have gratitude for what you have done. And secondly, I have gratitude for what everybody else has done. And then it says, this is my body given for you. Do this, eat this meal, have a meal in remembrance of me. Now, again, what he says here, and I've talked about this before, what he says here in this remembrance of me is not just this communion, not just bread and wine, bread and juice. He's talking about this entire meal. Every time you sit together for a meal, do this in remembrance of me. When you sit at tables with your family, when you sit down and you have Thanksgiving dinner, for instance, do this in remembrance of me. Every meal you have together. For us at this church, communion looks a lot more like what we do when we have lunch over in the other building, more than it looks like us having bread and juice here in this room. That's what communion is. He's talking about this whole meal. Do all of this in remembrance of me. And then he goes on. He says, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then in verse 20, in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. This new covenant, this is where the New Testament really starts. This is where this new covenant, because the old covenant was this lamb that would be killed. This is the new covenant. He's saying, I am that lamb. I am that one. Do you see? This is the new covenant. This is the New Testament of what's happening here. This is my blood, which is poured out for you. That's believed as probably the third cup, by the way, of the Passover meal. It's the bitter cup. But then things get truncated in the book of Luke, and it shortens up a little bit. In other Gospels, this goes for a long time. Here it goes very short. It's a very short account of this Last Supper. And it's believed that there were parts omitted from the book of Luke because it was getting past people who didn't know anything about Jesus, and they were getting very confused about the rituals. And so they took some things out of the book of Luke because it was getting too confusing. And so there's some parts that might have been omitted here because of what happens here after this. But the very next verse says, as soon as he finishes talking about this, he says, but the hand of him who is going to betray me is with me, is mine on the table. So do you understand? His hand is now on the table. Remember, Judas's hand is now on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to the man who betrays him. And then I love this, because what I love is Luke misses some other parts, but the thing he does tell us is what goes on in the disciples' hearts. What are the disciples thinking at this moment? How are they perceiving this moment? And what we learn is the disciples don't get it. They miss the whole thing. They miss all of the gratitude. They miss all of the thanksgiving that's going on. They miss all of God's faithfulness to them. And instead, it says, after that, it says, they began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. So who's going to betray Jesus? Which one of you is going to be the one that does it? And they're all pointing fingers and saying, you did it. You're going to be the one who does it. You're like the worst. I know you're the worst of all of them. And like, I hate your guts and I hate your guts. And then things get real ugly. They start having fights. Things are getting like really gross. But then in verse 24, great line. Also, a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Terrible timing, guys. Are you kidding me? So the fight starts off with who's the worst of them, but as with all of us, as soon as we start to look inward and say, well, which one of us has the potential to be the worst of us? Which of us has the potential to be the one who would turn on Jesus? Which of us has the potential to be the one who's fallen down on the job? What we start doing then is we're like, I could do it, I guess, but I'm not as bad as you are. Right? And you start playing the comparison game. I'm a little better than you. And you're like not good, and you're probably the worst. And so it starts to turn from who's the worst to who's the greatest. They start having these fights. Like, you can just see them. We love to label things. We love to have hierarchy of who's the best, right? We love this. And so they start to go from who's the worst. Now they're starting to go they pull out scrolls, I'm sure, of all the good things they've done. Look at all the good things I've done. And someone pull out CVS receipt long scrolls of what they've done in their lives. And here's all the good things I've done. And there's no way it could possibly be me. They start to have a fight. Notice what's going on in the disciples' hearts. They've missed the entire thing. They've missed the whole point of God's faithfulness to them because now they're starting to justify their faithfulness to God. Don't ever think that God's faithfulness to you is contingent upon your faithfulness to him. And that goes for both sides of us. Maybe you're here today and you're in a spot where you're like, I've messed up a lot. Like I've messed up a lot. I have not been faithful to God at all in anything that I've done. Don't assume that that means that God's not faithful to you still. And maybe we're on the other side, and a lot of us, if you're like me and you grew up in church, you've been around this for a long time, maybe you're in the spot where you're like, no, I've been faithful to God a lot, and therefore God has to be just as faithful in doing everything I want and acting in how I want him to act and do everything perfectly the way I've aligned things to go, not the way he's aligned things to go. Don't assume it works that way either. His faithfulness to us is contingent upon him being a faithful God, not upon us being faithful people. His character is just to be faithful. And there are moments we have to learn to be grateful because he is faithful. It's not because of what we've done. It's because of what he's done. And Jesus sits them down, and you can almost feel him just like having this like youth group squabble. And all of a sudden he's like, guys, settle down. And it says, Jesus says to them, the king of the Gentiles lords it over them. This is Rome, who he's talking about. And those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules should be like the one who serves. I was at a conference this whole last week. I was speaking for a bunch of missionaries in Fort Myers that work all over the world, and they are all in agriculture. And so there's an organization there that runs reforestation projects all over the world. It's phenomenal. So there are about 300 missionaries that came back together, and they work through agriculture specifically. And they asked me to come speak for about 15 minutes a day and just do devotion. So I spoke for about 20 minutes a day because I'm a pastor, and you can't stop me. I'm just going to keep going. And so they had this really great like workshop going on, all these different things that they were talking about, and it was amazing seeing all these people who've given their lives to serving in other countries being there. And I mean, I knew I was out of my element the first day I got there. They had a book signing that they were doing that night, and everybody was pumped. And it was like this author was going to be there. It was going to be a big deal. And they put his book up on the screen. They were like, he's going to be here to sign books tonight. And the title of the book was something about using manure to cover over your crops so they can last an extra season. And I was like, I don't think I belong here, guys. Like, I'm not sure I'm prepared for this conference. And so speaking of this conference, and there was a day where I was talking, and I spoke about a few things that we've talked about here of the Good Samaritan and different things. And I was having this conversation with them about how sometimes what God wants to do is not necessarily what he wants to do through you, but sometimes about things he wants to do in you. Sometimes we're worried about what God wants to do through us, like God wants to go do all these cool things through us, but really what God's trying to do is not transform everybody else around us. He's trying to transform us first. And it's hard for me as a pastor sometimes because I want God to do all these cool things through me. And what I'm learning is God just wants to do really cool things in me first and just spend time there. And so I was talking about that one morning, and this little lady, there were all kinds of people from different faiths and different backgrounds of Christianity who were in the room. And there was a friar there, which was really exciting to meet a friar, and different people from different backgrounds of this. And one lady was a nun, and she came up to me, and she had her little headdress on, and she came up, and she was so sweet. And she had her habit, like just the top part of her habit. I'm not sure what the rules are where she's at. And she told me, she said, I've been working in Haiti and it's getting really hard. And I don't know if you know what's going on in Haiti right now. Haiti is in just a mess. Over the last year, they elected a new president. And that new president came in and was given literally billions of dollars by other countries. And he embezzled almost all of it. Took it for himself. Used none of it on the country, and it's a country that desperately needs the help, a country that's in bad shape. And so what he would do is, and this is true, he would paint, like he took a movie theater, they had like one movie theater in Port-au-Prince, and he took it and he painted the outside of it and then didn't do anything to the inside of it and said that was $500 million. and took that $500 million for himself. And so people they don't have jobs, they have no infrastructure, and the country is at complete unrest right now. People are so desperate for food and for lodging, like just for homes. I mean, it's crazy. And so that what they do a lot of times is they sell their children to orphanages, because orphanages make more money, the more money that Americans will give, because there's more kids in that orphanage. So they will literally have to choose if they want to sell a child to an orphanage, because that might be better for their children, honestly, and that orphanage gets more money that way. I mean, this is the world that they're living in. And she goes, it's just so hard. And she said, and for me to be there is so scary, which is true. Any person who goes there from America, it's a scary place to be. And I told her, I was trying to commiserate with her. I was like trying to feel for her. I said, that's true. And maybe, I get it. You've got to take care of yourself. If maybe God's telling you not to go back, and I understand that, I'm trying to tell her, it's okay. Don't feel bad about it. And she looked at me, and what she said was, she actually said, I have to go back. And I thought she was going to say, because I owe it to those people, or because I care about those people. And her words were, because God's been so faithful to me. It wasn't about God's faithfulness to them or through her. And she actually told me, she said, Pastor, that's what you just talked about. By the way, she did mention that, which hurt a little bit. Touche, none. That's what you just talked about, is God's been so faithful to me that I have no choice but to go back. And she was working out of this attitude of understanding God's faithfulness to her first and what that inclines her to do. When Jesus talks about serving others, the reason he's talking about it is because God's been so faithful to you. As we sit around tables this week, may we understand there's a big story here. And there's a lot of things we have to be grateful for. And first of all, may we be people who are grateful for that story. But secondly, may we be people who don't just keep the story to ourselves, but who share that story and pass down that story. I guarantee you guys, I've shared that story about my daughter many times. I've never had anybody say they're getting tired of it. God's faithfulness to you is something you should be sharing constantly, consistently with people who need to know it. May we be people who understand the full story, and we're grateful for that. We're grateful for what God's doing to us, his faithfulness to us, but then we're telling others about it. We're sharing it with others. So today we're going to take a few minutes as we close, and we are going to take communion. And as we take communion together today, anybody's welcome to go over and pick that up. You can bring it back to your seats if you're more comfortable. You can come back to your seats and take it here if you want to. You can stay over there and take it, whatever you're more comfortable with. But I'd love for you to take communion in just this small sacrament of a way. This isn't the full picture of it, maybe just a way that reminds you. And in this moment, may you be thankful. May we all be grateful. May we all have this Eucharist of what God's done for us. And secondly, I really would ask you to have God bring to mind those stories of his faithfulness in your life. May he bring those stories to mind, and may he give you the courage or the presence of mind to share it with other people this week. So if you would, let's stand together, and we're just going to sing a song, and you're welcome to go get communion as we sing. Let's stand together, and we'll pray. Jesus, I thank you for this time. I thank you for allowing us just to be in this place. And we just thank you for being this God who came to earth, who shows us the full picture of what salvation looks like. I just pray today, God, that there are so many moments in our lives that we know you've come through for us. We know you've come through for us. We know there are things you've done for us in our lives that we can't deny. And today, God, I pray that you would remind us of those things, that you would bring forth just those moments in our lives that you have been faithful over and over and over again, even in moments that we haven't been faithful to you, the moments that you've been faithful to us. Even in the moments that we've fallen away, that you have been faithful to us. Would you remind us of those moments? Call them to our minds so we can share them with others, that we can sit around tables and tell the story of your faithfulness to us. And may it inspire others to see your faithfulness to them as well. I thank you for this time. I thank you for this community. I thank you for this week and what it means to us to be able to have a time that we set aside to remind ourselves of our gratitude, our gratefulness, and how it's directly correlated to your faithfulness. Thank you for this time. I pray we wouldn't take it for granted. I pray we would spend time in your presence and with your people, being able to tell the stories. Praise things in your name. Amen.